Hi and welcome to Check Your Thread, the podcast that will help you sew more sustainably. My name's Zoe and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 14 years and I'm creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge Me Made May. But, like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and the way that my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me in this journey. There is so much that we can learn about sewing more sustainably when we look beyond just garment sewing and take a broader view of craft and creativity. I've always been fascinated by people who have been able to express themselves in a variety of disciplines. Perhaps you're the same. My guest for this week's episode and next week's is Heidi Parkes, an improvisational quilt artist, mending expert, garment sewist, and so many more things living in Wisconsin, USA. Heidi's relationship to craft, art and creativity has taken her on such an interesting journey, and she shares it so beautifully. In today's part, Heidi explains how developing a habit of curiosity has allowed her to explore her interests whilst moving through different but connected creative worlds. Plus, Heidi shares what is the most unusual textile item she has repurposed in a quilt. I promise that you'll never guess. So stay tuned a few minutes for that conversation. But first, hello, wonderful listener. Are you doing okay today? I hope that you've been well since last week's episode. It's been a pretty busy week for me. I taught the zero waste cropped shirt pattern as a sewing class at the weekend, which I greatly enjoyed. The pattern is designed by previous guest Birgitta Helmerson, and I really love it, and I'm excited to be able to wear one of the samples that I made for the class. I also had the pleasure on Thursday evening of chatting with Yvette, one of the creators of the Stash Hub app, which I mention fairly regularly on this podcast. So Stash Hub do a series of Instagram lives called Stash Chats, and our conversation was the second one so far. If you missed it but would like to hear us talk about the current state of my fabric stash, plus my latest thoughts on how best to organise it, then you can check it out on YouTube, and I'll put a link in the show notes to that. Thanks to those of you who engaged with me about last week's episode on successfully acquiring second-hand sewing machines. Lots of you shared your own stories with me of how you obtained your own second-hand machine. There were many tales of wins and a few woes. It was so great to hear all these long-term relationships with machines that didn't cost you very much. Some even cost nothing. And of course, it's keeping existing resources in the form of sewing machines in use and out of the scrap heap for longer. Anyways, relating to that episode, I have a little secret to share. I'm actually in the process of writing an ebook, which will be packed with tips just like the ones that were in that episode. It's all about sewing more sustainably, but doing so on a budget. I've been working on it for a while now, and I have a wonderful team of beta readers who are all patrons of the podcast. They're helping me make it as useful as possible. I'm still at the writing stage and I don't know when it's going to be available, but obviously I'll keep you updated. So are you making anything at the moment? I've been having a busy time recently, so I've not been in the headspace for a very involved project. Plus, I'm still feeling pretty overwhelmed by all my scraps. So my sewing endeavours have continued to be focusing on using the scraps and leftovers, inspired by Scrap Busting September, as organised by my recent guest, Meg Grandstaff. The other evening, I got my head down and made a pile of hair scrunchies for some very pretty strips of fabric in my stash. A couple of them are going to be for me because mine seem to have vanished, and the others are going to be put in the party bags for my daughter's birthday in a couple of weeks. I always try to keep the contents of my kids' party bags plastic free. So when I realised that all my daughter's guests have long hair, I realised I could kill two birds with one stone by using some scraps and having another plastic free thing to put in the party bags. Well, kind of three birds if you include saving money actually. I'm claiming that as a sustainability win for this week too. No new patrons to thank this week. However, I do get to convey big thanks to existing patron Jen for upping the amount of their support. Thank you, Jen. You're a star. This podcast is entirely reliant on lovely patrons to stay afloat. So if you enjoy Check Your Thread and you feel you could afford the price of a cup of coffee each month, or more or less, to keep things going, please find the Patreon link in the show notes or on the website checkyourthread.com. So, back to today's episode. Heidi has a beautifully clear way of speaking, but the words she chooses so carefully convey a lot. So listening back to this conversation when I began the editing process, I really felt that this recording was so rich with meaning. I wanted to give everything she said and shared as much space as possible so you can enjoy and absorb it to the fullest. Which is a long-winded way of saying I've split this conversation up into 2 parts. I know you're going to enjoy this part, so make sure you're subscribed to the podcast in your app of choice so you don't miss the second part next week. So I found out about Heidi through a previous Check Your Thread guest, Eliu Hernandez. Eliu creates amazing quilts from materials that he harvests from jeans. So if you haven't heard that episode yet, make sure you queue up episode 26 to listen to after this one. Lots of lovely stuff in the show notes this week. Links to everything and everyone mentioned, plus some gorgeous pictures of Heidi and her work. So head to checkyourthread.com to find the show notes. So until next week, please take care of yourself and enjoy. Thank you so much for doing this. Can I admit, I'm a little bit nervous. I think because I've been listening to so much of you.
Oh, that's true, you have.
So enormous thanks for doing this. I'm particularly grateful because I was just listening to you on your latest appearance of Seamside, Zach Foster's podcast, and you were talking about how you have to kind of pick and choose what things you agree to do. So I'm extra grateful that you agreed to talk to me for the podcast.
Well, I'm extra glad that I did too. I cannot tell you how impressed and excited I am that you've listened to so many things and seem to be very familiar with who I am. That doesn't always happen. And then I feel like I'm getting asked sometimes very redundant questions on podcasts.
Oh, really?
And if people heard other ones, then...
Yeah, I think it's the kind of the least you can do, no?
I know, right? I always listen to at least an episode. I feel like it's the least I can do to know the energy of the podcast I'm being interviewed on. But I don't know that happens all the time either.
Well, thank you for doing your research as well. So let's just jump in straight away because as you know, I've got loads of stuff I want to talk to you about.
Sure.
So would you please tell us who you are, where you are, and what fills your days?
I am Heidi Parkes. I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the United States. It's in the Midwest by Lake Michigan. And I fill my days with a lot of quilting and mending clothing and teaching about those subjects. If I were to expand on that a little bit, I do improvisational quilting and think about quilting in a way that's very similar to painting. I like to begin with the composition and have a lot of asymmetrical balance in my quilts. One of my favorite styles of quilting is diary quilting, where I am telling the story of the maker, but I don't think of it as autobiographical quilting because it's not necessarily all accessible to the viewer. Diaries hold a lot of secrets and have a lot of metaphors and can be a place to plan potential forks in the road and work out what I want to do next. So for me, diary feels like a very authentic way of explaining that type of quilting that I do.
Oh, that's amazing. That's beautiful. I could go in so many directions from that, but I'm going to put a pin in some of them. So having listened to you on various other podcasts and been, reading your Instagram posts and everything, and I was watching some of the softball videos that you were in as well, I was kind of sitting down and thinking of what do I want to talk to you about? I was like, there's so much. So I got a bit of kind of paralyzed by that. So I kind of went to the source of how I first found out about you, which is your friend and previous podcast guest, Eliu Hernandez. So I actually talked to Eliu and I messaged him going, Heidi Parkes is going on the podcast. What would you like to hear her talk about? So if you're okay with that, I'm going to start with some of his questions.
Oh, that makes me so happy. I adore Eliu.
So how did you meet him?
Eliu reached out to me on Instagram. He was really interested in my work, and I think he went up and down the whole feed several times a few years ago. And we've met in person several times. He lives in Colorado, and I've gone out there for work several times to be with the Makery and teach with them. So we always get together for dinner and get to catch up in person. And I've seen him at QuiltCon a few times, and I think it's our shared appreciation of reuse and repurposing.
Yeah, he's so all about that, isn't he? He takes it to so many extra levels that most of us even thought was possible, doesn't he?
I have some thread that he harvested for me, and I just it's so beautiful, and it's hard to decide which project to commit to with it.
Oh, really? So you're holding on. When it feels ready, it's gonna.
I know. I need to dive in.
Oh, lovely. Okay, so Eliu would like to know. He said that he heard you recently speak about the ongoing process of finding out about who you are as a quilter, and he'd like to hear you talk more about that, specifically like where you are in that process, and like how do you gauge who you are, and then also like how will you ever find out if it's kind of like an ongoing evolution?
Oh, of course, that's a brilliant question from someone who knows me really well. So I first got into asking that question when I moved into quilting and decided that was going to be my art form back in 2013. I made my first fabric quilt in September, and 9 months later I quit my job and became a professional
So it's always been your
quilter.
10-year anniversary as a quilter.
Yes, it is, and I'm trying to celebrate all year long.
Awesome.
So at that time, rather than trying to do something in particular or trying to emulate someone that inspired me, I was very much returning to my fabric and the design wall that I was using at the time and asking, what does a Heidi Parkes quilt look like?
Yeah.
And showing up with curiosity is something that I return to all the time. It feels as authentic to describe today as it did 10 years ago.
Which is amazing. Because that's surely the source of everything. Like, if you're otherwise, how will you grow?
Exactly. And I got so inspired about a year ago when I read Brene Brown's book, Atlas of the Heart. She talks about, I think, 84 different emotions and defines them and helps us understand emotion better. And she described the emotion of curiosity as being both an emotion and a trait, and that you can create a habit out of being curious, and that is a habit that leads to a lot more joy, because then you're not wondering if you're going to meet some kind of expectation all the time. You're not measuring yourself or judging.
Yeah, there's no end point, is there?
Yeah, with that true wonder. So I find that I still get very curious about what kind of quilter I am, what I feel like doing today. I just finished a quilt last week. I started it in November, so it was a long 7-month process, I think, or 8-month process. And I was turning 40 in December 2022, and I wanted to make a quilt that asked the question of what is it like to change decades, and what's the shift that I'm about to experience as a 40-something. And so that was a very fun discovery. It's a quilt that happens to have 5 garments on it and a placemat. So it's a lot of repurposing Eliu style, but very, very colorful quilt, which feels fresh for me.
Yeah, I can't wait to get into that a bit more about your repurposing. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to expand on Eliu's line of inquiry a bit and kind of ask you, like, how do you see yourself? Like, I know probably people might not want to put yourself in a box as such, but do you see yourself as a quilter or an artist, a maker, creative, a combination, all of them?
I see myself as a combination of those, and I see myself as very lucky that I get to move through multiple worlds in that way. There are certainly a lot of quilt world events and things that I do, and the quilt world was probably the first place where I felt really welcome and that felt very accessible. And when I'm in a quilt show or engaging with the Modern Quilt Guild or the SAQA, the Studio Art Quilters Association, that's a very exciting place to be. And I do a lot of teaching of quilting, and I think most people find me through the quilt world.
Right. So that is a home of sorts for you.
Yeah, and I think it's the space that pays most of my bills and keeps me employed, which I'm very, very grateful for. But I also think of myself as an artist. I went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and graduated in 2005, and I was a high school art teacher for 9 years.
Wow.
And my first love was ceramics. In high school and college, I was an assistant to a ceramic artist. And I see a lot of that influence of ceramics in my quilts now as well. That curiosity. My grandmother also loved pottery, and she lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and would talk about the kiln gods and opening the kiln and wondering what the glaze would turn out like, rather than always being disappointed that the glaze wasn't just like the test tile.
Like, what have they delivered for you today?
Yeah, so that background of the art worlds was very exciting for me, and it's a space that I enjoy a lot. I get so much pleasure from going to the art museum and listening to art lectures. It's a cool thing to be an art groupie, if you will. You're much more likely to meet your Lady Gaga or your superstars. So anyways,
But that's
very
you.
much
That's
enjoy.
you for so many people. You are the Lady
sometimes.
Gaga.
Exactly. And, I got to meet Mark Bradford back in 2011, and it just melted my entire heart. I was so excited. And so I love being part of a microcosm like that, both in the quilt world and the art world, where that kind of thing is possible, and where you can also be famous but still get to live a really normal life in a way that movie stars unfortunately don't get to.
Do you get spotted on the street?
Not often, no.
So it has happened.
Maybe if I'm at a quilt shop, but not just at the grocery store. But yeah, the art world I really adore, and it's a very exciting space for me. I just had my first solo show in an art museum.
Oh, congrats.
And so that was very exciting to have happen. And then the makers movement is another space that I identify with a lot and enjoy. The idea that my student might not be quilt obsessed, but that they might be someone who's looking to paint the walls of their house and then carve a spoon and then do some gardening, and that part of that wholehearted living with handmade objects would be something that I could support by teaching them how to make a quilt or repair their clothing.
Yeah, I love that kind of cross-pollination of different genres, and I think it's probably quite rare, I'd think, that you'd find one person that's just interested in one discipline, isn't it? Although I think my husband would say that I'm obsessed with sewing, which I am, but like to not have any interest in another form or another medium I think that's weird. Basically.
To me, that's certainly very normal, and that's a big part of why I was a teacher for as long as I was, because I loved ceramics and painting and drawing and textiles and cooking and fermenting things. And
oh, do you?
Yes, yeah. My mother and my aunt are amazing cooks and taught me to be, very, very excited about the kitchen.
Do you garden as well?
A little bit. My garden might look a little wild.
So I was kind of wanting to talk to you a bit more about your quilts and their intended purpose. Like the quilts that you make, do they have an intended purpose to be used like on a bed or on a sofa, or are they more kind of pieces that you would find like maybe hung up? Do you have their intended purpose in mind when you make them, or is that something that influences them in some way, even if that's maybe subconscious possibly?
I think that most of my quilts I intend for the wall. That was something that was a huge question that I had when I first got started,
right.
and was trying to figure out what a quilt for me looked like. And I had a lot of alumni support from the Art Institute. And I remember going in and saying that I found 3 quilters who seemed to be kind of making a living and being professional quilters. And we looked at Luke Haynes and Pauline Boyd, I think. I know her as Counterpane. And Mara Grace Ambrose from Folk Fibers. And I was showing these 3 websites to the artist advisor. And they said, one of these websites is showing the quilts as though they're on a white wall in a gallery and doesn't mention the word quilt or textile very much. They're focusing on art. And 2 of the other websites are showing the quilts folded in a stack and draped over a couch and in these very homey views. one side obviously wants to be in your home and the other side wants to be in an art gallery. And it'll be important for you to decide on your website where you want to show people that your quilts can live. And so if you've perused my website, it's very much a white wall website. And for a while, I think I thought it would be easier to carve out a career making things for the home. I really wanted to be a maker of blankets and functional objects at first, just because I thought that would be a way to have a career and wake up in the morning and sew quilts. And then I made things and I kept making things that really felt like paintings and that felt like they should be on the wall. And so that was a discovery that even though I thought I was going to go one way, I made things and it turned out very much that I was making quilts that are for the wall. So I think overwhelmingly that I think of them as pieces of fine art. And as part of them being fine art, I suppose conceptually, I love the idea that my quilts are still functional. They could still have that purpose of giving comfort and wrapping around and cocooning someone. And there are a lot of fine art quilts. For example, I recently went to Expo in Chicago, which is one of those big fancy art fairs. And textiles are having a moment there. There are a lot of quilts, a lot of textiles on display, a lot of what I'm kind of interested in calling performing textiles, where someone might have a canvas and then they put a bunch of gesso on and then they stick a washcloth on the canvas or they stick a doily on the canvas. And so they don't necessarily have any skill in the textile arts, but they are including textiles in their art and thus perhaps performing textiles. And a lot of times in that world as well, there will be just a very different approach to craftsmanship where the things will be on the falling apart side or not laying flat at all whatsoever. And sometimes I think about pushing that edge even more than I already do. I think that I am known for having a lot of exposed knots on my quilts and a wobbly edge around the border and breaking a lot of rules that maybe make a traditional quilter kind of itchy. But compared to the art world that I come from, I'm very buttoned up still. I'm very much making functional quilts that perhaps look a little too useful to even be in that show.
Oh, this is so interesting. And this is really responding back to Eliu's question as well, like who you are. It sounds like you are finding out who you are through the objects themselves. They're like, well, It looks a bit like it's kind of this. It's also a bit like this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, I like to try to trust my hands as much as possible and lean into what feels good to sew. And it just so far doesn't feel good to sew things that are too far on that edge of falling apart or looking haphazard. And I love that feeling of it being somewhat functional and having so much that pure potential of warmth and love and care that a quilt has. I don't want to rob my art of that in a conceptual aesthetic way even. I like that it has the potential to be a useful object.
Wow, that's so interesting. So do you take commissions for quilts or are you kind of just working on your own, what wants to be made? Or both. I mean, it could be both, couldn't it? Someone could commission you to make what you want to make.
Mm-hmm. True. So this year I did quite a few commissions and they were great experiences. But I think in the effort of having a balance in what I make, now I'm wanting to lean back towards doing less commissions. Of course, I said that, and then I got asked to do an absolute dream commission. So I am working on one right now. It's for Mary Louise Schumacher. She is an art critic here in Milwaukee, and she's about to move to the East Coast for a new job. And part of packing up and moving means that she's digging through the things that she inherited from her mom, who passed away in 2015. And her mother was an extraordinary quilter and, like me, a teacher of quilting. So Mary Louise brought over a big Tupperware of her notes and her samples for teaching and a bunch of in-progress quilts and some yardage. And it's a very exciting commission. And I think especially because Mary Louise is from the art world, she's truly hands off. Like, here are the materials. Anything you make with this, I'm excited to discover what it will be.
Oh, wow.
And so it's a wonderful process. I've been having the best time working with those materials. And
do you feel like you're getting to know her mother a little bit, like through her
yes.
notes, through her textiles?
Yes. Yeah. And so some of the things that I'm doing are that she had a lot of teeny tiny applique prepared that she had basted around the edge, smaller than a dime if you're used to what money looks like in America. And those tiny, tiny bits of applique, I decided to place in the shape of a calendar. I use a lot of calendars in my work. It, of course, reminds me of a diary. And in the UK, they say diary and they mean what I mean when I say calendar.
Sure.
So that's kind of a fun nod.
No, it's true. Yeah, we use the word both, as in like to diary is in to write your secrets.
Yeah, you'll put things in your diary.
Oh, yeah, I'll
and
pop
you
in the
mean
diary.
Yes. So I'm putting a calendar of the dates from when she requested the commission till when it's due. So I think it's from May till October. I'll have a calendar there. And I've eventually ran out of little bits of applique that her mother prepared in advance. But now I'm going through and using a tiny piece of each fabric because she had this gorgeous collection of either flour sack fabric or 1920s replica fabric yardage that she owned.
That must be incredible to use.
Oh, it's so fun. It's just a dream to be working with her fabrics. And there's this long tradition of a friendship quilt and also a postage stamp quilt where ideally you use a different kind of fabric for every single little block or piece in the quilt.
Wow.
So I love that if I'm doing, over 100 little tiny applique pieces, that then I could highlight the richness of her stash of fabrics that she has.
Yeah. I also really love that idea of you've got the prepared pieces that she prepared initially, and then at some point those run out, and then you kind of, using her materials, you took over, and it shows the collaboration that you're having in a sense, doesn't it?
It does. Yes. And so it's that curiosity again showing up of what kind of relationship can I form with this story and with these materials, and not so much controlling or trying to have it be a very specific way.
Yeah. So I've heard you describe yourself as a monotasker. So do you tend to just have one quilt on the go at a time, or have you got a few and you wake up and see what needs to be worked on today? Or
my dream is to be a monotasker.
Okay.
When I first started quilting, I was absolutely 100% a monotasker.
Okay.
And until I had the answer to what happens if I do whichever thing was making a quilt, then I felt like I didn't know what question I wanted to ask next.
Oh.
And I kind of wished at that time that I could at least have one quilt that I was piecing and one quilt that I was quilting.
Oh, okay.
And I felt somewhat incapable of even doing that, of moving that far forward. Now, because I'm teaching, there are several things that I often have on my plate at any one given time. So I just finished my diary quilt that I was making for myself, but also in January, I was teaching a diary quilting class, and I wanted to have a diary quilt in progress to share with my students. So I had to be doing that one. And then in the time that I've been working on that 7-month-long quilt, I did 3 commissions total for larger quilts.
Wow.
And I also started a quilt at QuiltCon in Atlanta, Georgia, because I was teaching a class called Humongous Curvy Applique.
It's the best title ever.
It was a very joyful class. We had a lot of fun, and I taught the class twice, so I used the same base piece of fabric to add to in both classes. So now I'm working on that sample will ultimately be neutrality study, either number 4 or number 5, whatever number I'm on in that series.
You seem so prolific.
And then I also made 10 small quilts, like these 6-inch by 6-inch framed quilts, because
Wow.
I was getting a lot of emails could I please do a commission for one of those small quilts, because I was sold out on my website. And it's just too much emailing for a small quilt. It doesn't make sense financially to send that many emails. So I thought I better make some so that there are some on my website. I love the thought that I have an arc of accessibility with all of the things that I do, that I have a lot of free things that are either podcasts or on YouTube or Instagram, and then very accessibly priced things with Creative Bug, and then on-demand workshops, leading all the way up to right now I'm selling a class where I will be teaching in England in May of 2024, and it's a beautiful, luxurious retreat where we're going to take classes from other artists like Emily Jo Gibbs and Wild Floss, and we're going to go visit the Royal School of Needlework.
Where is this? Where is this retreat?
It's at Goodenstone for the first week, and then it's in London for the second week.
Oh, wow. Oh, so you'll be able to take some classes as well?
Yes, exactly.
Fun.
Exactly. I'll be able to take classes and then model for students how I'm adding what I learned in those classes to the travel diary quilt that I'm making. In that particular class, it will be a block-based quilt. So we'll be able to make blocks, and every student will choose for themselves if it's a square block or a rectangular block and how big. And I'll keep introducing different techniques and things, and then we'll talk about how to arrange the composition and sew them together at the end. And they'll have access to my on-demand class for hand quilting at the end so that they can complete the quilt when they get home. And it's an expensive offering because it's a really luxurious, special thing to do. And I'm always trying to think, how can I have that arc where I can meet everyone? Someone gets to go with me to the UK, but a lot of people also get to learn from me for free on YouTube. And my art, I like to have something similar. So these small pieces are an accessible price point, and then my larger quilts that I spend months and months on are many thousands of dollars, as I think they should be.
Absolutely.
And so having my small pieces be sold out for as long as they were made me think I must get some new ones on the website. So
that must be so nice knowing that there's more people are able to enjoy your work, have it in their hands, have it in their homes, have it in their life.
I get a true thrill when people say they want to live with something. It's more than a financial commitment. It's a really aesthetic commitment of wanting to see something every day and to invite me into their living room or kitchen or bedroom. And so I get very excited about that, and it felt like an important priority. All to say, I've made a lot of quilts so far this year, and I also made myself a quilted shirt and a quilted purse. And
I want to get onto your garment making in a bit as well, but I'd like to get a bit more into the practicalities as well. Mm-hmm. So can you tell me a bit more about the materials that you use? Because I know that repurposing textiles plays a big part in your work.
Yes, the materials that I use, the things that I buy from the store the most often are wide yardage cotton muslin.
Right.
And that to me is a very special tool. It gives me the feeling that I'm working with a blank white canvas as though I'm painting. And then sometimes I'll dye that. Cool. So one of my favorite ways to use natural dye is to store up in my kitchen all of my onion peels or onion skins and my avocado pits and peels. And I then eventually boil them and strain the water and then dye that muslin in the kitchen scraps. And it makes a beautiful pinky orange color. So that is a very favorite material of mine that I begin by buying fresh, but then I often alter it a little bit. And then I also buy a lot of things from the annual rummage at the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Art.
Oh.
It was on my top 10 list for reasons to move from Illinois to Wisconsin back in 2015. And my friend Zach Foster, who I know you're familiar with, he flew from Brooklyn, New York this June to visit me, but also to volunteer at the rummage and get first pickups of things there. So it's a very special opportunity to buy fabric.
It's luring people right, left and center, this place.
Yes. And then when I'm traveling, I love having the memory of buying something when I'm traveling. So my most recent time abroad was in India in 2019, and I was there for a 2-week yoga trip because I love doing yoga. I'm a certified yoga instructor. And then I spent the last week visiting a college friend of mine, Jyotika Purwar, and she took me to many special places in Mumbai to buy fabric, including a block printing studio. And I got to meet the multi-generational owners of the studio and see the block printing happening. And those are some really precious cottons and silks to me that I, loved spending money to buy and to support that tradition. And then I also, the last 2 places that come to mind that I frequently get fabric, number 1 are from my closet. If I'm retiring some clothing, I will put that in my quilts.
I heard as well that I think you got some items from, was it from your mum?
Yes, the thing that I love to do is having fabric gifted to me. So recently I was at the art museum where I'm exhibiting, and I did a week-long artist residency, and someone very timidly sent an email before I even arrived and said that she had some quilts and family textiles that she was wondering if maybe I wanted to pick a few of them. And I looked through, and of course I wanted them all. They were so special. And those moments really delight me when someone is looking for a good home for something that they just don't have the space for anymore, and it doesn't serve them to keep them. And I adore getting materials given to me, especially when they have all that handwork in them and that heirloom beautiful quality.
Yeah.
So
that's a real honor as well for somebody
yes,
to,
yes.
I don't want this to go in the bin. This is important. Can you be the bearer of
it's
this?
a lot of trust, and it's very special to me when I receive things like that. I have to be careful not to just have a blanket email. I don't share my shipping address because I can't just take everything, but especially if it's someone that I get to meet in person, it's really moves me when people give me things like that.
That's so lovely. So, okay, this is a bit of a silly question, but what's the weirdest thing that you've repurposed into a quilt?
I would have to say that it would be an adult diaper from Japan.
Okay, that wins, definitely.
My good friend Takako Wilden, I know her from the Quilt Museum in Cedarburg, Wisconsin, and she told me one time several years ago that she was headed to Japan to visit family, as she always does every year. And would I like her to bring some things back in her suitcase? And I could not believe the offer of giving me a portion of her 50 pounds in her suitcase. And my mom, I'm a millennial, but I'm on the cusp. So my mom always trained me to keep an extra $100 cash in my purse just in case something happens. So I whipped out my emergency Hondo and shoved it at her. And I was like, yes, Chicago, please buy me $100 worth of Japanese fabric. And she came back with this incredible bounty. I'm forever humbled at the amount of weight of fabrics she put in her suitcase for me. And it included 2 children's diapers and an adult diaper. And I used those on my quilt when I was making it. There's nothing like feeling seen and known that Takako would know I would be so overjoyed to receive a diaper.
She knows you well.
Yeah, she knows me really well, and especially the fans who give me things too. They're beautiful objects, and they know me so well, and they go right in the quilts immediately. And this one is in my vignettes quilt number 2. It's one of my quilt patterns, is the vignette quilt.
Right.
And the second time I followed that pattern, I didn't have the heart to cut up the diaper even. It covers the whole bottom right quadrant of the quilt, just shamelessly is a diaper.
Okay, I'm going to go. Is it on your website?
It is.
Okay, I'm going to go find it.
It's one of very few tied quilts, so it will stand out to you because it has a lot of yarn ties. I had to visually break up the diaper a lot. So.
So good. Okay. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing Zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palmskin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!